forward to this.
I am too. Hopefully it's worth the anticipation.
Yeah, go.
What? Thank you. Can my thing stay there and just stay on the...
Yeah, if you just plug it back in, it should come it up.
Hard for no reason.
Okay, gentlemen, have a seat, please, so we can get going. Come on in. Have a seat. Ian, we'll take a couple announcements real quick. Is that okay? Gentlemen, come on in. Have a seat. Come on, let's go. All right, let's take some faculty announcements. Dr. Kelly. Any other faculty? How about students? No.
So just to let you all know, there's an opportunity for all of us to civically engage ourselves with the federal government. We have the opportunity to meet on April the 20th, which is the National Walkout Day. It's organized by the Parkland students, the survivors of the Parkland shooting, to go down and visit with the office of our congressional representatives, the Chief Legislative Counsel in Senator Ben Cardin's office, Bill Van Horn, and the Chief Legislative Counsel in Congressman Sarbanes' office from District 3, which Gilman is located. And we have the opportunity now to go and discuss gun safety legislation and constructive dialogue with those members of Congress. So anybody who's interested in doing that on April the 20th, please come to A103. I think that's Mr. Baum's AMCO classroom during this year.
Students. Any students? Any other students? Stephen, go ahead.
All right, so coming up, we're going to be showing a documentary that was made by a couple of students at Towson called The Voices of Baltimore. And The Voices of Baltimore, it's a documentary that captures and preserves the rich oral histories of an aging and diminishing population of African Americans who grew up in the Mason-Dixon border area of Baltimore and who lived through the era of legal segregation. And the goal of the film is to extend the project to digitally record and present the narratives through audio and film documentation. The narratives will document the relevant lives of individuals who attended segregated schools and desegregation before and following the 1954 Supreme Court Brown v. Board of Education ruling. The film's going to be shown Friday, April 13th in the lecture hall. We've got long lunch, and we want everyone to sign up to ensure that there's space reserved. There's going to be pizza before the documentary begins, and if you're interested in attending, meet down front after assembly to reserve a space. Yeah, that'll be in the lecture hall on the 13th, and if you have any questions, contact myself, Dr. Dennis, or Matthias. Thank you.
You didn't see the signs that said white in color. You saw them when you went downtown.
We had to leave the building to go to the bathroom.
And some places you just didn't go.
There's another world that's different from my own comfortable world.
It didn't hold you back. It really propelled you further, I think.
I need to stand up for what is right.
We were arrested, we were tried.
Mediocrity was not acceptable.
You have to be twice as good.
And we were always reminded we were doing this not just for you and your family, but for a whole race of people.
What we saw in 2015 could have happened in the 1930s.
These are tumultuous times, but you know what? This too is going to pass. I'm not going anywhere.
If this dies on you, just hit the big track button.
Good morning, gentlemen. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about visualizing baseball. Okay? Baseball is a game of statistics. There's always been a close link between the game and the statistics that we use as a written description or even a written record of the game. Not long after the first games were played, and even before the rules were codified, written records in the form of box scores were published in a daily paper. This is an example of one that was printed in 1857 in the New York Clipper. Okay? Not long after the first games were played, Henry Chadwick was one of the first baseball reporters and was the first to publish a box score. Okay? Box scores included the names of the players. At times, different things were included, including the number of times they came to bat, the number of hits, the number of outs they recorded, things like that. Okay? The first box scores were patterned after cricket reports from English newspapers. Henry Chadwick, as I said, was one of the first baseball reporters, came to the United States from England and was a huge cricket fan. He was a journalist, and his first job was with the New York Times in 1856, reporting on cricket matches. A friend of his introduced him to the game of baseball that was beginning to take off in various areas in New York, and he became a dedicated and passionate follower of baseball. And within a year, 1857, he was a full-time baseball reporter for the New York Clipper. For a long time, the statistics kept about the game were reactive. And by that, I mean they were simply a description of what had happened in the previous game that you could use to follow what was going on. and also to evaluate performance. We could see through time whether a player was particularly good by looking at how many hits he got, game after game after game. On a big scale, the data that was collected was not used for game time decisions. This was primarily the tension because of how and what information was collected and how quickly it could be processed. In the middle of the 20th century, however, that began to change. And it began to change primarily due to this man. Does anybody recognize who this is? This is Branch Rickey, okay? This is a quote from him that I think you all saw on the Daily Record this morning. Branch Rickey played briefly in the major leagues, but spent the majority of his career as a general manager for 3 different teams: the St. Louis Cardinals, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the Pittsburgh Pirates. He's most well known today for his relationship with Jackie Robinson and his work to get Jackie Robinson in the Major League Baseball. I would argue, though, that other contributions he made were almost, if not as important as these. He is responsible for 4 of the major changes in baseball through the 20th century. In addition to his work in breaking the color barrier, he was responsible for the development of the farm system. He was responsible for the expansion of the game to the West Coast, making it truly a national game. And for our purposes, he was responsible for the beginnings of using data to change the way that the game was played. In 1947, the same year that Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier as a player, Brooklyn introduced Alan Roth. Mr. Roth was the first statistician to work full-time for a Major League Baseball club. He was charged by Branch Rickey with watching games, collecting information, and developing information that would give the Dodgers an advantage. Some of his notable accomplishments include the things that are up here. He was very interested in charting the runners advanced. He was looking at the success rate of bunting. Okay? He looked at batting averages in various contexts. 1 out, 2 out, 0 out, men on first, men on second. Looking at how successful different players were in different situations. He was one of the first to really look carefully at their performance versus righties and versus lefties, which led to the development of what's now known as a platoon system. It had been used before, but never with the numeric background that it was now. And also interesting, he was the first to produce what would now be called a spray chart. Essentially, he looked at every player that the Dodgers had and where their hits occurred. Were they getting hits to left field, to center field, to right field? Okay? An example of how this information was used, in 1947, the Dodgers traded right fielder Dixie Walker to the Pittsburgh Pirates. Walker was a 4-time All-Star. 5 times he was in the top 10 in MVP voting. And at the time he was traded, he was just 1 year removed from being the runner-up for MVP and a .307 hitter with 90 RBIs. He was an immensely popular player. And when Branch Rickey traded him to Pittsburgh, fans went crazy. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Well, Rickey had noticed in consulting with Roth that in looking at the spray charts for Dixie Walker, he was no longer pulling the ball as effectively as he had before. As a right fielder, that was his bread and butter. They noticed through this analysis that he was beginning to lose effectiveness. And Branch Rickey was always one to trade players a year early rather than a year late, so they traded him. Sure enough, within 2 years, Walker was out of professional baseball altogether. His effectiveness had fallen to the point where he could not make a team. It is amazing what was beginning to work. In 1960, George Lindsay, as a Canadian Air Force officer, published a seminal paper in a journal of operations research. Operations research is a branch of mathematics that looks at the application of different mathematics fields to questions in business and industry. George Lindsay worked for the Canadian Air Force and was stationed at various places around the world. His job during the day was to look at the data that was had and to analyze the possibilities and the potential strategies that the Canadians thought the Russians might have in attempts to primarily in intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay? He was involved with strategies to counter that. By night, he spent his time poring over hundreds of games. He and his father had listened over the course of a handful of years and kept really, really careful records of over 400 games, looking at every pitch, every count, every out. He was looking for data to investigate questions related to baseball. Was a stolen base a good strategy? When was it worthwhile to do a sacrifice bunt? Okay? In the effort to answer these questions, he developed the first run expectancy tables. Now, it's a very complicated looking thing, but essentially what he did is he looked at these hundreds of games and hundreds and if not thousands of different situations, and he put them in categories. And what he was looking at here is there are, at every baseball inning, you can look at the situation as one of 24 different things. Along the top, you have the bases that are occupied. Either you could have nobody on, you can have a man on first, man on second, man on third, man on first and second, first and third, second and third, or the bases can be full. And with each of those, you could have 0, 1, or 2 outs. What Lindsay did was to take a look at every time that these situations had come up in the thousands of innings that he looked at and tabulate how many runs were scored in the remainder of that inning. So what this chart tells you is when you come up with 0 out and 0 on average, teams score about 0.46 runs per inning. If you get your first guy on, that jumps to 0.81. And he was able to use this information to evaluate different strategies. For an example, let's take a look at one possible play. You've got 1 out, you've got a man on first and second. The odds tell you, the numbers tell you that on average you're going to score about 1.12 runs for the remainder of that inning. Is it worthwhile to try and steal? If you steal and you're successful, what have you done? Well, you've moved from 1 out, man on first and third, to 1 out, man on second and third. So you've moved from here to there. On average, that's going to score you 1.56 minus 1.12, 0.44 runs. But what happens if you fail? If you fail and you get thrown out, now you've got man on third, 2 outs. So you've slid from 1.12 expected runs to 0.36. So a loss of, what is 0.76 runs. When is that chance, that trade-off, going to be worth looking at? Well, it depends on how successful your base runner is at stealing. Those are numbers that you can know, and you can figure out how successful they would have to be for that to be a worthwhile attempt. This was the first time that a significant amount of data was being used to think about strategies as the game was evolving, as the game was playing. How might we change the way we play the game based on the situations that we have? This whole thing expanded exponentially with the dawn of the 21st century and the new computer systems that are available for tracking what's going on in baseball. There are 3 of them that are out now. In 2006, PitchFX was created. PitchFX has got, at every Major League Baseball stadium, Doppler radar to track the trajectory of the ball as it is pitched, hit, thrown. They generate over 20,000 samples per second for every second that the ball is in play, and can report the exact location of the ball as it's released, the pitch speed, the pitch spin rate, the pitch spin axis, okay? Hundreds and hundreds of different variables that they can keep track of. Okay? StatCast is the second one. StatCast was developed through the 2010s. It was first in all stadiums in 2015. It combines the technology from the PitchFX with special cameras that are along the first and third base line that allow you to capture stereoscopic vision. That allows us to track players and evaluate player speeds. Sometimes you see on the Major League Baseball broadcast the route efficiency, the speed, the highest speed attained by players. All of that is based on StatCast. There's a new one that's involved. It's called BioFX. It has just been released over the last year. At this point, none of the information that they've got is released to the public. It's all proprietary information for the team. It was designed to track in-game biomechanics for the players. If any of you have seen sports science, where they put the sensors on at all of the joints and they can watch what's going on as you're pitching or throwing or catching or jumping, they've got the ability now to do that without the sensors. And they can do that real time as the game is going on. They can see if a pitcher is releasing the ball at a different point because he's beginning to get tired. Okay? The difficulty with all of this is how much data there is now to sort through. As I said, baseball has always been a game of statistics. When StatCast went online in 2015, if you think of all of the data that's ever been collected in Major League Baseball about any game that's ever been played since the Major Leagues came into play in 1873 for the National League, okay? The amount of data that we had on a baseball game and on all games of baseball doubled in one day because of the amount of data that's collected. They collect from every baseball game, the amount of data is approximately 7 terabytes. Okay? That's an enormous amount of information. And the question is, what do we do with that information? How do we analyze that? How do we sort through it for what's important and what's not important? This, I think, is the next frontier of sports analysis. There's so much information now. It's not a question of we need more, it's a question of how do we evaluate what we've got. Okay? What I'd like to finish with is a handful of images that are different ways that people are now starting to use that. I like these images because I like things that are visually interesting. These are mathematical in nature, and I'm just going to take a look at 3 or 4. There are literally dozens of different ways that you could look at it. This is a game from last year's World Series. It was Game 5 with the Dodgers 13-12 in 10 innings. Okay? What's graphed here is what's called the win probability. You can do very much the same as was done with the run expectancy. You can calculate after each at bat the probability that each team wins. And it's based on similar situations in the past. 2 out, no one on, you've got a 1-run lead. You can figure out that the probability that you're going to win the game is such and such. What I like about this is it really shows you sort of the ebb and flow of what happens during a game. During the early part of this game, the Dodgers really were in the lead. Okay? They had the chances that they were going to win were high. During the 7th inning, Altuve hit a home run to tie the game, and from there out, things happened a little bit differently. The Dodgers came to. To me, I think this is a really visually interesting way of looking at a game. It's also fun, once you have seen this, to go back and watch a game. It's really kind of cool to see how it all fits together. Second one, this is one of my favorite players, Lorenzo Cain. No longer a Royal, just got traded this year to the Brewers. But this is what's called a radar graph. And what it looks at is they've chosen 12 different measures of baseball ability. And this is looking at how he compares to the average player in all of them. 100 is the average player. So we can see that for the 100 is this ring right here where the 100 is. He is outside in just about everything, with the one exception. His bases on balls rate. He does not take walks very well. In fact, he is a little bit worse than their average player. In every other category, he was an exceptional player, including almost twice as much defensively and 2.5 times offensively. This is in 2015, his best year in professional baseball. To me, this is a very interesting visual way of looking at it. When looking at the numbers that you see, it's a little bit harder to put it into context. Humans are very visual in our analysis. Most people are much better looking at visuals than they are at looking at stacks of numbers. This is another one that's one of my favorites. One of the new things that's really been looked at, and you may have heard if you've watched any baseball, is talk about the launch angle and the launch speed. These are 2 of the new numbers that have been developed through the StatCast. And what this is looking at is how do those numbers, the angle that the ball comes off the bat, the speed that the ball comes off the bat, how do they relate to the probability of getting a hit? They've taken a look at huge numbers of data, and we have a level on the side. The color tells us how likely it is to be a hit. Brighter yellows to almost white, very likely to get a hit. What does this graph tell you? Well, some things it tells you are pretty clear and not too surprising. If you've got balls that are coming off the bat well over 100 miles an hour, pretty rare, that's a heck of a hit. The chance that you're going to get a hit is really, really high. The few exceptions to that is if your launch angle is really, really big. What does that mean? If your launch angle is really, really big, what's going to happen to it? It's going to be a pop fly, right? Okay? It's not going to have the depth to make it out. The other thing that's interesting is if you don't have that kind of launch speed, so you're hitting the ball like mere mortals, what do you have? What do you see in here? Well, this is another area of high probability for hits. It corresponds to less of a launch speed and a launch angle that's low. So what's going to be happening in here? Small blooper pop flies over the infield, but not quite to the outfield. Balls hit into the gap. Okay? There are ways of looking at things that we wouldn't have had available to us before. Two really quick ones to finish up. Last year when the World Series was going on, somebody decided to take a look at a couple of things. They're looking at the swing rate, which is the percentage of pitches thrown to a player that they swing at, and the miss rate. Of the times that they swing, how often do they miss the ball completely? And they looked at that for the teams that were in the World Series. This is not just data from the World Series, it was for the year. And they noticed this. What do you notice about that? Anything interesting here? To me, it's really interesting that all of the Astros are in this central region. And the Dodgers are spread out all over the place. You have Dodgers that don't swing a lot and don't miss very much. Pretty good plate control. You have Dodgers that are really free swinging and miss a whole lot, including Bellinger, who misses a lot. Okay? Whereas the Astros seem to be in general a little bit more disciplined. Overall, their miss rate is lower. They do swing a little bit more. Okay? So really interesting stuff to look at. And how does that affect how they play? Well, somebody took that same information and went here. What this is looking at is in what areas of the strike zone are players more than 50% likely to swing? Again, this tells a story of different types of hitters. From the Dodgers, you've got players here. What does that say about a player? Swings at everything, right? Okay, there's not a lot of plate discipline. Whereas somebody like Jose Altuve, he's got a very small zone that he swings at. And if you were to look at it in terms of this and his hitting, my guess is you'd find that this area in the center of the strike zone, he's got a very high rate of contact and a very high rate of success as a hitter. And he's got the discipline to not swing at things that aren't in his zone. It's why he's one of the best players in baseball today. Okay? And I'm going to leave it there, just because I just wanted to show you a few things in terms of how we can use different visuals to tell us something about the game of baseball. Okay? Thank you.
Let's have the center dismissed.